My life had always been peaceful and predictable, much like a calm river. I worked at the local library and it brought me satisfaction. Every evening, I'd come home to my husband, Aaron. We'd been married for 10 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, it felt solid, based on trust and mutual respect. Everything was as it should be until Javier entered our lives. Javier, an old friend of Aaron, had always been a bit of a mystery to me. They'd met in college, but then they went their separate ways, with Javier moving to another city. Aaron rarely mentioned him, and I only occasionally heard about his business successes. So when Aaron told me that Javier was moving back to our city and would be staying with us for a while, I was mildly surprised, but nothing more than that. The day Javier arrived, Aaron asked me to meet him since he was running late at work. I agreed without hesitation, thinking it would be a simple introduction. When Javier pulled up to our house, I greeted him with a smile, trying to be welcoming. It had been ages since we last saw each other, so I was glad to catch up. Javier looked just like I remembered. Tall, confident, with a smile that could charm anyone. But something felt off. There was a new intensity in his gaze that made me uneasy. It was subtle, like a sudden chill filling the room. We sat in the living room, I offered him coffee, and we started chatting. He talked about his work, about how he'd been considering moving back to his hometown for a while. His words were familiar, but there was an underlying tone that I couldn't quite place. With every word he spoke, a sense of unease grew within me. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but the feeling intensified. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was because of the time that had passed, or the fact that we'd both changed over the years. But something inside me told me there was more to it. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. When Aaron finally came home, I felt a wave of relief, as if his presence could dissolve the strange tension. But when the three of us sat down for dinner, I couldn't stop focusing on Javier. Every gesture, every word, seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Aaron didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. He was just happy to see his old friend, while I did my best to act normal. But inside I was a mess. That night I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in bed, listening to Aaron's steady breathing, trying to figure out what was happening. Why was I reacting so strongly to Javier? I tried convincing myself it was just exhaustion, but my heart told me otherwise. His words, his looks kept replaying in my mind. I knew this encounter would change something in my life, but I couldn't grasp exactly how. It all started the day Javier came to town. His arrival was the stone that disturbed the calm waters of my life, forcing me to see everything differently. A few days went by, and I tried not to give too much importance to my feelings, chalking them up to the usual nerves when reconnecting with someone from the past. But the strange sensation inside me didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing day. I found myself thinking about Javier more, replaying his words and looks, wondering if they meant more than just casual friendship. One evening, Javier invited Aaron and me to a cozy restaurant on the edge of town to celebrate his return. I hesitated, not wanting to go, but Aaron was eager to see his friend, and I didn't want to ruin his excitement. That evening I dressed carefully, unsure of why I was doing it. Was it for Aaron or for Javier? The restaurant was quiet, the perfect spot for a relaxed evening without distractions. We sat by the window looking out at the city lights. The conversation flowed easily. We laughed about old times and Aaron talked about his work, with Javier listening intently. But I couldn't help but notice how often Javier's gaze lingered on me. It felt like a gentle touch, but it made me uncomfortable. When Aaron stepped out to take a phone call, the tension in the air seemed to rise instantly. I was left alone with Javier, and the silence between us felt heavy. He leaned in slightly and quietly said, "Lena, there's something I've been meaning to tell you for a while." His voice was soft, but there was a quiet certainty to it that made me tense. I didn't know what to expect, but I could already feel that something was about to change. "Javier," I started, trying to cut him off. "Please don't." But he ignored my words and pressed on. "I can't keep this to myself anymore. Since I saw you again, I realized I never stopped thinking about you. What I feel is more than friendship. And I think you feel it too." His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I stared at him, unable to respond. All the feelings I'd been experiencing over the past few days suddenly clicked into place, and I was terrified by how real they were. I did feel something for him, but I was too scared to admit it even to myself. It was a disruption to the life I had carefully built. I knew that if I said a word now, I'd be betraying everything I held dear. Aaron returned to the table, and the tension shifted into forced cheerfulness. I tried to keep my composure, but inside I was trembling. I avoided looking at Javier, afraid he would see the emotions I was desperately trying to hide. The rest of the evening felt like a strange mix of forced politeness and inner conflict. We went home, but I felt like a stranger in my own house. My heart was a storm, and I knew things couldn't stay the same. That night sleep eluded me again. Javier's words, his gaze, nothing could give me peace. I kept thinking this was all wrong, that I needed to stay away from him. But deep down, I already understood that once a spark of attraction is lit, it's impossible to snuff out. It grew inside me like a fire, just waiting for the right moment to flare up. After that night, I made a decision. I had to keep my distance from Javier. Our meetings were becoming too dangerous, and something was developing between us that could destroy everything. I decided to stay away from him, hoping that time would help smooth out the rough edges that had suddenly appeared between us. But, as life often does, fate had other plans. A few days later, Aaron left for another business trip, leaving me alone in the house. This was nothing new. I was used to spending my time alone, keeping busy with household chores and losing myself in books. But this time it felt different. Every minute seemed to drag on endlessly, and I couldn't shake thoughts of Javier. His confession, his voice, his eyes. It all haunted me like a shadow. By the third day of solitude, I heard the doorbell ring. When I opened the door, there he was. Javier, standing on the threshold with that calm expression of his. "Hello, Lena," he said, a slight smile on his lips. "I figured you might be bored, so I thought I'd stop by." My heart raced, but I tried to remain calm. Common sense and courtesy told me not to let him in, but something inside pushed me to step aside and let him enter.
"Hello, Javier."
"Of course. Come in," I said, trying to mask the quiver in my voice. We walked into the living room, and he took a seat on the couch, casually looking around. I offered him coffee, avoiding his gaze. The room felt strange, filled with an awkward silence, broken only by the sound of the kettle boiling. I could feel the tension building between us with every passing second. I brought over 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him, hoping that a normal conversation might break the ice. We talked about trivial things, details that normally wouldn't matter but, in that moment, seemed significant because they kept us from confronting the real issue between us. Still, I couldn't help but notice how my words were becoming jumbled, my thoughts starting to tangle. His presence felt so close, so tangible, as if he were right beside me. Eventually, our conversation dwindled, and an uneasy silence fell between us. It was tight, like a string pulled too far. Then, without warning, Javier stood up and walked toward me, stopping only inches away. I looked up to meet his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes took my breath away. "Lena," he whispered, his hand gently brushing my cheek. "I can't keep this in any longer." His touch was soft, almost weightless, yet it sent every emotion I'd been suppressing into overdrive. I wanted to pull away to tell him this was wrong, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me. I couldn't step back. I looked into his eyes, and in that moment, everything between us seemed to vanish, leaving only the undeniable tension that I could no longer ignore. Javier leaned closer, his face drawing near. I could feel his breath against my skin, and in that instant, the world around us seemed to shrink to nothing but this moment. I knew I should stop. I knew that this could ruin everything, but I couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest like it was trying to escape. Then he kissed me. His lips were gentle, but that kiss carried so many unspoken emotions that I lost all ability to think. In that moment, everything that was wrong, that was impossible, faded away. All that remained was this overwhelming feeling that consumed me completely. When our lips finally parted, I felt something inside me snap. I looked at Javier and saw that he was feeling the same. We stood there in silence, fully aware that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. That kiss marked the beginning of something new, something dangerous, something that was now inevitable. Javier stepped back, giving me space to collect myself. My hands trembled and I tried to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like leaves in the wind. I knew without a doubt that this moment had changed everything. The days that followed were filled with a torturous inner battle. I tried to return to my usual routine, but nothing felt right. Every time Aaron looked at me, I saw my guilt reflected in his eyes. Every touch from him reminded me of the trust one had betrayed. But the worst part was realizing that I couldn't stop what had started between Javier and me. We began meeting in secret. Our encounters were few and far between, but with each one, they became more tempting, more inescapable. We met in secluded places, parks on the outskirts of town, deserted cafes where no one knew us. Each time I promised myself it would be the last. But the moment we were alone, all those promises crumbled to dust. Then one day, Aaron came home and unexpectedly announced he'd be leaving for an extended business trip to a neighboring city for several days. I would be alone, and while that gave me the opportunity to think about everything that had been happening, it also filled me with growing anxiety. I knew Javier would want to see me, and this time I understood that it wouldn't just be a simple meeting, it would be something more. Something that could destroy everything once and for all. Javier called me the morning Aaron left. His voice was calm, but I could sense an underlying tension in it. He suggested we meet later that evening at the park. I hesitated for a long time, but in the end I agreed. Even though every part of me screamed that I was making a huge mistake, I spent the rest of the day in painful contemplation. Yet, when evening came, I still found myself on my way to meet him. The park was empty. The sky was overcast, and there was a heavy feeling in the air, as if rain was imminent. Javier was sitting on a bench, tucked away in the shadows of the trees. I walked toward him, and as he looked up, his gaze was full of warmth and understanding. For a moment everything else faded, and it was just the two of us. We sat together in silence, the kind of silence where words no longer seemed necessary. "Lena," he said, taking my hand in his, "I can't keep pretending anymore. I can't hide this." His words struck a deep chord within me. I knew he was right, but I couldn't bring myself to accept that our feelings could ruin everything I had with Aaron. My heart tightened in pain, but I couldn't find the strength to stop it. We sat there for what felt like forever, lost in our thoughts and emotions, until the rain began to fall. Javier suggested we go to my house to escape the storm, and without thinking I agreed. We ran through the park laughing like carefree children, unbothered by the rain or the approaching storm. But when we reached my house, I realized I had just made a grave mistake. Our clothes and hair were soaked through, sticking to us from the rain, but none of that mattered. A wave of desire washed over me, and I knew I couldn't hold it back any longer. We were too close, and before I knew it, Javier kissed me again. But this time it felt different. This kiss wasn't just about passion. It was filled with desperation, the sense that we might never have another chance. Then, just as everything felt like it was spiraling into something inevitable, I heard the front door open. My heart stopped. Aaron was home. I pulled away from Javier, panic flooding through me, and quickly moved toward the hallway where Aaron stood, drenched and looking confused. "Aaron," I started, but I didn't have the chance to finish. His gaze locked on Javier, who had stepped out from the living room, and I could see the confusion in Aaron's eyes turn to pure rage. It all happened so quickly. Aaron marched toward Javier without a word and struck him hard. I screamed, rushing to stop him, but Aaron was beyond control. "You betrayed me," he yelled, his eyes burning with fury. "You, my friend. You, my wife." I tried to explain, to apologize, but no words came. My throat was tight, and the truth felt suffocating. I could only stand there, helpless as everything I knew fell apart. Aaron and Javier fought, and I tried to intervene, but I was pushed aside. I had no strength left. I was completely overwhelmed by the chaos. Finally, Javier broke free and, without saying a word, ran out of the house. Aaron stood there, breathing heavily, fists clenched at his sides. "Leave," he said coldly, not even looking at me. "I never want to see you again." I understood in that moment that it was all over. My heart shattered, but I knew there was nothing I could do to fix it. I gathered my things and left, walking out of the house, leaving behind the life I had worked so hard to build. The rain kept pouring down as I walked through the streets, directionless, not knowing where I was going. Inside, all I felt was emptiness, the crushing realization that I had lost everything I once held dear.